ancient city of Palmyra in Syria, 2,000 years of history now in the hands of Islamic State. And this is the result, the temple of Baal Shamin destroyed. Its long-term protector, 82-year-old Khaled al-Assad, was murdered. The antiquities scholar had bravely refused to reveal to the terrorists the location of valuable artefacts.
What we are seeing in northern Syria and Iraq is a humanitarian catastrophe, and it is a strategic catastrophe. We have seen again and again unspeakable atrocities at the hands of these people, most recently the public beheading of an 80-year-old antiquarian who had done so much to preserve the ancient culture of Palmyra.
These atrocities could soon draw Australia into battle in Syria for the first time since the country's civil war began, extending a campaign until now restricted to Iraq, where the government in Baghdad has asked for help.
The moralities are absolutely the same on both sides of the border. The terrorists don't respect the border, so why should we?
This time it's Washington making the request for assistance in Syria. Or is it? Several reports say Tony Abbott orchestrated the invitation.
The US approach Australia, or did Australia approach the US about airstrikes?
Oh, you know, look, these are silly things. This came up in a conversation between the President and the Prime Minister. Who asked who? Is it, they're important leaders. It's an important alliance, as I just discussed. We regularly discuss things of mutual concern regularly. We don't try to keep track of who asked for what, this type of thing.
When President Obama raised it with me, I said that I would have our officials talk with each other, and as a result of those conversations, a formal request has now come from the Pentagon.
So you're confident?
But while the government might frame this move as an important and logical step, defence officials say something different.
The contribution of Australia, while I always welcome, isn't a game changer one way or the other.
I think we've seen some concern at high levels within defence about the way this military decision is being framed to suit domestic political purposes. It's clear that there is a division between what defence would like to be saying about this and what the Prime Minister's office is saying.
At the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, former military officer James Brown agrees the change would be a minor tactical shift.
On one level it makes sense. The boundary is pretty arbitrary at the moment, and there is no point in letting Daesh have sanctuary in eastern Syria. If all we're talking about is loosening the regulations that are governing where our aircraft can strike, it won't require a lot more resources. It will require a change to patrolling, some rules of engagement changes, but that's about it. There's not a lot more involved.
Until last week, the coalition had conducted 2,381 airstrikes in Syria. Almost all of them were carried out by American fighter jets. Other nations taking part are playing a much smaller role. They include Bahrain, Canada, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Many of the strikes are directed at IS fighters around the group's stronghold of Raqqa and the border with Iraq. But is it wise for Australia to take sides in the Syrian civil war? This is the town of Douma near Damascus last week, the site of a brutal bombing raid by Syrian government forces that killed scores of civilians. By launching airstrikes, Australia would be aiding the regime of Bashar al-Assad, whose army is fighting Islamic State in eastern Syria.
Well, the government and the US government has always said Assad needs to go. Now, the $64,000 question has always been what replaces him. And if you want a leader to go, then the last thing theoretically you want to do is to be bolstering his security forces. So theoretically, yes, it's not the second order effects of what you do may inadvertently assist the Syrians.
The Lowy Institute's Roger Shanahan also notes that the coalition conducting airstrikes in Syria is shrinking, as Saudi Arabia and its allies are diverted to hostilities in Yemen.
Well, the Prime Minister's been on record as saying what he doesn't want is the West versus Islamic State, and this broad coalition that they were talking about proves that it's not the West versus Islamic State. If that coalition is now contracting and continue to contract, what we're going to end up with is the West versus Islamic State, which is exactly what Prime Minister said we weren't going to have.
I think at the moment what we're seeing is strategy by soundbite. The objectives, the military objectives of this campaign are a bit muddled at the moment, and there are a number of policy inconsistencies that need to be worked out if we're going to do more in Syria.
As the government prepares to make the move, Labor is mulling it over.
I'm consulting with my colleagues and we've requested further information and, of course, the legal basis upon which such an action could be contemplated.
A final decision on the American request will most likely be made next week.
It's really going to have negligible, if any, operational effect. We've got 6 aircraft. Those 6 aircraft aren't going to be directed against Syrian targets. You might have a couple of sorties over a period of time, dropping the odd bomb here or there. It's not going to be operationally significant. Therefore, why are we doing it? And you can only draw the conclusion that this is a politically driven, not an operationally driven imperative.